Hello class, in this video we will discuss the key revisions on PSA 315, identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatements. So here are the content of our discussion. So first, we'll take a look at the revised PSA 315 and then check the objectives of the IAASB in revising PSA 315. We also discussed the summary of the content of PSA 315, which is identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatements. And then we will examine closer the overall changes in the revised PSA 315, including the key enhancement in PSA 315. We'll also look at the major changes and revision in the key part of PSA 315, so which include the understanding of the entity system of internal control and identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement. We'll also check the revision on the definition of significant risk and the introduction of the new concept, spectrum of inherent risk. And finally, we'll close our discussion with the changes in the documentation requirement under PSA 315. So let's go to the first part. So let's take a look at the revised PSA 315. So the revised PSA 315, identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement, was issued by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board last December 2019. And it was approved for adoption by our local auditing standard setting body, the Auditing and Assurance Standard Council, last March 2, 2022. So this is their resolution. So PRBOA Resolution number 32, Series of 2020. So adopting the PSA 315 Revised 2019, identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement. So which is effective for audits of financial statements for period beginning on or after December 15, 2021. So for 2022 audits, so our audits of financial statements for this period 2022 and moving onward, so moving forward, so this will already be the applicable auditing standard. So this is the effectivity date indicated in the standard. Now, for PSA 315, the old or previous version, the title was PSA 315 Redrafted, Identifying and Assessing the Risks of Material Misstatements Through an Understanding of the Entity and its Environment. But as you can notice, so the new or the revised PSA 315 has more streamlined title. So it just says Identifying and Assessing the Risks of Material Misstatements, which we will see later on, because the focus now of the revised PSA 315, it was really on the identification and the assessment of the risks of material misstatements. Next, so let's look at the objectives of the IAASB in revising PSA 315. So the IAASB, or the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, so said they revised the PSA 315, number one, to establish a more appropriate risk assessment. So including a focus on scalability. So meaning to say they wanted the standard to be applicable to audits of all entities regardless of sizes. So whether it's a large, complex entity or a smaller, less complex entity. So another is to deal with rapidly changing business and audit environment. So that is why they have added portions or guidance within PSA 315 that address automated tools and techniques, including data analytics. So another is to enhance the application of professional skepticism when performing risk assessment procedures. So in fact, so within the text of PSA 315, there are more specific guidance on how the auditor can exercise professional skepticism in performing risk assessment procedures. So next, there are also a lot of clarification on the nature and extent of the auditor's required understanding of internal control. So including more specificity in identifying controls that are relevant to the audit. And then finally, to develop guidance and tools to support the implementation of the PSA 315. So that is why if you look at the actual revised PSA 315, so there's a lot of examples as well as appendices to support the application of the revised PSA 315. Now let's look at the summary of the revised PSA 315. So if in the previous standard, so that what's being highlighted is the understanding or obtaining an understanding of the entity's environment. Here in the revised PSA 315, much of the focus or the highlight is on the identification of risk of material misstatements in the financial statements of our client. So that is why under the revised PSA 315, so what is required for the auditor is to perform risk assessment procedures. And in the performance of risk assessment procedures, we always apply our professional judgment and exercise our professional skepticism and the need to document our procedures and findings in our audit working paper. So we perform our risk assessment procedures to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence as a basis for the identification of the risk of material misstatements in the financial statements of our clients. Now we perform risk assessment procedures to obtain understanding of the entity and its environment. So it's still there. So meaning to say we still need to obtain understanding of the entity and environment of our client. Okay, so although the focus now is more on the identification of risks of material misstatements. So there's also a renewed focus on the understanding of the applicable financial reporting framework and how it affects the misstatements or possible misstatements in the financial statements of our client. And finally, we also need to obtain understanding of the entity's system of internal control. So in obtaining understanding of these matters, so we will be able to identify the risk of material misstatements in the financial statements of our client. So particularly, the risk of material misstatement at the financial statements level and the risk of material misstatements at the assertion level. So when we say risk of material misstatements at the financial statement level, so these are the risks that will have a pervasive effect on the financial statements or on all or many assertions in the financial statements. So that is why we need to evaluate the nature and extent of those potential events and circumstances that could affect a lot of items or all of the items in the financial statements of our client. Another is the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. So these are the risks that would affect specific assertion or items within the financial statements of our client. So that is why when we assess the risk at the assertion level, so we determine the significant classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures, including their relevant assertions. So there are also revision on the description of assertions under the revised PSA 315 that we will discuss later. Now, this is another key change in revised PSA 315. There is now a separate required assessment on inherent risk and control risk. In the previous PSA 315, it's allowed to have a combined risk assessment on inherent and control risk. But under the revised PSA 315, it is now required to assess separately the inherent risk and the control risk. So as far as the risks of material misstatements in the financial statements of our clients is concerned. So also, some risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level so can also affect our assessment of inherent risk. And then, so after assessing inherent and control risk, so we identify significant risks. So significant risk is also revised under the PSA or the new PSA 315. Other assess risk of material misstatements, including risks for which substantive procedures alone do not provide sufficient and appropriate evidence. So, and finally, we need to also double check our findings or our assessment. So we also have to look on those matters that are considered material but not significant. So meaning there might be assertions or class of transactions, account balances, or disclosures that might be material based on our assessment of materiality but are considered not significant. So after identifying this, we will develop our responses. So our responses to risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level and assertion level so can include overall responses. For example, we have overall responses for risk identified at the financial statement level. We also have further audit procedures for risk at the assertion level naman. We also need to document the reason for designing further audit procedure for the specific further audit procedures that we will be performing. So for the risks for which substantive procedures alone cannot provide sufficient and appropriate evidence, so we'll need to perform as a response, so test of controls. So sometimes or in certain instances, there are items no that we need to test, but substantive procedures cannot provide for sufficient and appropriate evidence. This is particularly true for example highly automated processes, no? So wherein the evidence of the transaction would only be maintained digitally or for a very short period of time, so therefore it will be difficult for us to perform substantive procedures to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence, and therefore we'll be focusing on the controls over that highly automated process to obtain evidence. So we also need to determine our responses to significant risks and our substantive procedures for material but not significant class of transactions, account balances, and disclosure. So this summarizes the requirement or the procedures that we need to perform in accordance with the revised PSA 315. So in the next part, we will be discussing the changes in the revised PSA 315. So one key change is the removal of considerations specific to smaller entities, because as we mentioned in the objectives, so what the standard wanted or what the standard setting body wanted, the IASB, is for the standard to be applicable regardless of the size of the entity. So whether it is large and complex entity or smaller and less complex entity. Okay, so that is what they meant by scalability. So those requirement or previous requirement consideration specific to smaller entities, that specific section were removed, but the contents no, as applicable were already built into the text as applicable. So because those procedures, for example, that previously are applicable to smaller entities may also be applicable for larger but less complex entities. So another key change is the addition of automated tools and techniques in the guidance provided in the revised PSA 315, so including data analytics. But the standard setting body, IASB, chose to use automated tools and techniques, so because data analytics is narrower no, compared to the available automated tools and techniques for the auditor. Now, for example, the use of drones no, in stock taking will qualify under automated tools and techniques but are not necessarily considered data analytics. So another key enhancement or change is addition of a new introductory paragraph, so related to the auditor's considerations related to fraud, now including the introduction of the inherent risk factors. So we'll discuss the inherent risk factors later on in the identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement. And as mentioned earlier, so the enhanced application of professional skepticism. So instead of a broad mention of professional skepticism, there are specific guidelines now in the revised PSA 315 to help the auditor apply or maintain professional skepticism. So key enhancements or revisions in PSA 315. So with risk assessment procedures as mentioned earlier, so focus on the end goal now, which is the identification and assessing the risk of material misstatement. So previously, we defined risk assessment procedure as audit procedures performed to obtain understanding of the entity and its environment, including internal control, to identify and assess the risk of material misstatements, so whether due to fraud or error at the financial statement and assertion level. Now, according to PSA 315, we perform risk assessment procedures to provide a sufficient and appropriate audit evidence as the basis for identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement. So the focus now is on identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement, so rather than obtaining understanding of the entity and its environment. So but take note, so there is still or obtaining an understanding of the entity and environment is still part of our procedure under Revised PSA 315. So, but the focus is more on the identification and assessing the risk of material misstatement. So that's why there's still understanding of the entity and its environment. So in fact, more focus is now required on the entity's business model and the use of information technology, and also the introduction of the inherent risk factors. There's also more focus on examination of the applicable financial reporting framework and how it can affect to potential misstatements in the financial statements of our client. Now let us talk about the changes and the revisions on the section related to understanding the entity system of internal control. So under the revised PSA 315, so the controls definition was enhanced to include recognition of a less formalized policies and procedures, particularly applicable for smaller and less complex entities. It also added the concept of general IT controls and application controls, including the IT environment. So when we say IT environment, it includes the IT applications, IT infrastructures, IT processes, and IT personnel of an entity. It also has maintained the five components of internal control. So particularly the control environment, risk assessment process, information system and communication, control activities, and monitoring. However, the change is, or the what we call this enhancement, include classification of controls according to whether they are direct or indirect controls. So according to the revised PSA 315, indirect controls include the control environment, risk assessment, and monitoring components of internal control. And these indirect controls primarily affect the risks at the financial statement level. Okay? And direct controls include information system and communication and control activities. And these direct controls primarily affect risks at the assertion level. And based on these five components, what the auditor is required to do is for us to identify controls that are relevant to the audit. So when we say controls that are relevant to the audit, so these are the controls that could affect the assertions found in the financial statements level. And once we have identified the controls relevant to the audit, so we will consider the general IT controls that are relevant to the audit and perform test of design and implementation on those controls that have been identified. In the next section, in the identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatements, so there's now the concept of the inherent risk factors. So when we say inherent risk factors, so this is a relatively new concept. So it means characteristics or events or conditions that can affect the susceptibility to misstatement. So due to fraud or error about the classes of transaction, account balances, and disclosures now before any consideration of the controls. And according to the revised PSA 315, an item or an assertion would be more susceptible to potential misstatement. So if they have this combination, any or combination of these five factors, now which are number one, complexity, two, subjectivity, three, uncertainty, four, change, and five, susceptibility to misstatement due to management bias or fraud. And we will also use these inherent risk factors in determining the range of the potential misstatement or risk in the spectrum of inherent risk, so which we will introduce later. So the PSA 315 also revised the definition of relevant assertions and the significant class of transactions, account balances, or disclosures. So in the past, we have these categories of assertions, classes of transactions and events, account balances, and disclosure. So under classes of transaction and events, we have occurrence, completeness, accuracy, classification, and cutoff. Under account balances, we have existence, completeness, rights and obligations, valuation, and allocation. And under disclosures, obligations, occurrence and rights and obligations, completeness, accuracy and valuation, and classification and understandability. Now, these same concepts were still retained So under the new PSA 315, but they are much more streamlined only. Okay, so under the new categories of assertion under PSA 315, so we have two groups. So the related disclosures were already incorporated, so under the class of transaction and events and under account balances. So therefore, under the class of transactions and events and related disclosures, so we have occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cut-off, classification, and then presentation. For the assertions about account balances and related disclosures, so we have existence, rights and obligation, completeness, now accuracy, valuation, and allocation, so to capture the related disclosure. Then we have classification. So in the previous category, we do not have classification assertion under account balances. It's just implicit under the valuation. Okay, so but now there's a separate category or item of assertion related to classification under account balances and related disclosures. And then finally, we have presentation. Okay, so but the concepts remains the same, no? So with respect to the previous categories of assertion in the old PSA 315. So now there is a need to separately assess inherent risk and control risk. So as we have mentioned earlier in the previous PSA 315, it is allowed to assess uh, risk of material misstatement component separately or combined basis. So but now it is required to be assessed separately. So according to IASB, this is to prevent taking credit for identifying and assessing control risk by just identifying and assessing inherent risk alone. So in this case, there is a need to separately assess inherent risk by identifying the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level, so determining the preliminary assessment of inherent risk, and determining the significant classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures, and their relevant assertion. Then after that, we assess the inherent risk by determining the likelihood and magnitude of the risk and also by considering the inherent risk factors introduced earlier. Yung complexity, subjectivity, uncertainty, change, and susceptibility to management by susceptibility to misstatement due to management bias or fraud. So and then we have assess inherent risk at this point. So for control risk, we do not identify control risk. So what we do identify are controls relevant to the audit. Then we evaluate the design and determine the implementation of controls relevant to the audit, and then we assess the control risk. So one way to assess the control risk is to test the operating effectiveness of controls. So by this, we will be able to determine whether the control risk will be set at less than maximum or the control risk rather will be set at maximum. So based on our test of operating effectiveness of those relevant controls. And then finally, we will have an assessed risk of material misstatement at assertion level, so inherent risk and control risk that we will be used to determine the acceptable level of detection risk that we will set. So the acceptable level of detection risk will influence the level of audit procedures or audit evidence that we will obtain throughout the audit. And then also there's a revised definition of significant risk. Now in the past, significant risk is just defined that that these are risks that require special audit consideration. So now under the revised PSA 315, so significant risk is defined as identified risk of material misstatement. First, so for which the assessment of inherent risk is close to the upper end of spectrum of inherent risk. This one, for example. So close to the upper end of the spectrum of inherent risk. So this is an example of a spectrum of inherent risk. So due to the degree to which one or combination of the inherent risk factors, yung 5 factors that we have introduced earlier, and the likelihood of misstatement occurring or the magnitude of potential misstatement should that misstatement occur. So meaning to say, we will map the inherent risks that we have identified, so according to their magnitude and likelihood, and if it's on the upper end of the spectrum, high magnitude and high likelihood, then most likely that would be considered as a significant risk. Or they are required to be treated as significant risk in accordance with other PSAs. Now, for example, under PSA 240, so it is automatically considered that revenue is a significant risk. Okay? Or na PSA 550, so transactions related to related parties would be considered as significant risk. So if they are required in other PSA to be considered as significant risk, then they will also be treated as significant risk under PSA 315. And finally, on documentation, so not much has changed in the required documentation under the PSA 315. However, the standard setting body, IASB, expects that there will be more detailed or specific documentation. So as a result of changes in the requirements of PSA 315, like for example, more specific documentation, so related to the controls relevant to the audit and the identification and assessment of risk of material misstatement, including the significant risk and the reasons or rationale of the related significant judgment that we have made so throughout our risk assessment procedures. Okay, so that's it for some of the key changes and revision to PSA 315. So thank you.